My name is Lauren Hayes. I am 38 years old, and until recently, I was the Vice President of Global Mergers at Crescent Apex Capital. I was born and raised in Portland, Oregon, and if you had met me a few months ago, you would have met a woman who thought she had her entire career under control. I had spent nearly 2 decades in corporate finance, building a reputation as the woman who could close the kind of deals that made headlines and moved stock markets. I had worked my way up from the bottom, fighting past the whispers about being too young and too ambitious in boardrooms, where the average age hovered somewhere near 50. By the time this story began, I had already orchestrated acquisitions worth billions of dollars, and I had just spent 18 grueling months chasing the biggest one of my career. What I did not know then was that the very people who toasted to my success would soon try to erase my name from the story entirely. The deal in question was worth $3.4 billion. It was the kind of acquisition that could transform Crescent Apex Capital from a powerful investment firm into a global powerhouse. The target was Vanguard Nexus, a European logistics giant with roots spanning across 37 countries. I had been the architect of the entire deal, from the first quiet meeting in Zurich to the marathon negotiations in Paris that stretched until dawn. I had barely slept in weeks. My nerves were frayed, my phone buzzed day and night, and I was running on a dangerous mix of ambition and coffee. But I did not care, because this was my masterpiece, my moment, the deal that would make every grueling hour worth it. Or so I thought. The morning of the signing arrived crisp and clear, Manhattan glittering below the 47th floor of Crescent Apex headquarters. The conference room was a glass box with a view that made the city feel like a map under our feet. The table was polished to a mirror shine. Our European partners had flown in, our legal team was lined up, and every signature page had been printed and tabbed in neat blue folders. I wore my best navy suit, the one that made me feel like I could walk straight through a wall, and I carried my leather portfolio like armor. I remember thinking that morning, this is the day they finally see what I am capable of. But the universe and Victor Lang had other plans for me. Victor Lang, the CEO of Crescent Apex Capital, was a man who enjoyed walking into a room as if it already belonged to him. At 52 years old, he carried his power like a custom suit. He had a habit of smiling when he was about to ruin someone's day, and that morning, he smiled like a knife. He walked in without ceremony, his polished shoes clicking on the floor, and the room fell silent. I expected a few words of congratulations or some last-minute direction. Instead, Victor looked directly at me and said, in a voice that cut through the glass walls, "Lauren, you are no longer needed on this deal." 20 pairs of eyes turned to me, stunned. I felt my face heat, but I kept my back straight. He slid a termination letter across the table as if he were passing a menu. My heart pounded so loudly I could hear it in my ears, but I said nothing. If I spoke in that moment, I was not sure if my voice would crack or if I would burn the whole room down. I glanced at the letter, then at Victor, who looked smug, certain that he had just erased me from my own story. My hands did not shake as I closed my leather portfolio. I slipped the gold fountain pen he had given me a year ago, the so-called closer's token, into my pocket. Then I turned and walked out of that glass palace without giving him the satisfaction of seeing me break. He thought I was finished. He had no idea that I was already planning how to turn that moment into the biggest mistake of his career. The elevator doors closed with a soft chime, and for the first time that morning, I allowed myself to breathe. My hands were tight around my leather portfolio, but my mind was sharper than it had been in weeks. Victor Lang thought he had just ended my career in a single public strike. But what he did not know was that I had been preparing for this very moment. In corporate finance, you learn to expect betrayal the way sailors expect storms. I had been in the game long enough to know that if you are holding all the cards, someone will eventually try to steal your deck. That is why, months ago, I created a safety net plan that only I could trigger. It was my quiet insurance against the day someone tried to erase me. That day had arrived, and I was not going to let Victor Lang walk away with my work or my future. I reached into the inside pocket of my blazer and pulled out a small burner phone. It was plain black, cheap plastic, the kind of phone no one notices. I had carried it for 3 months and never used it, waiting for the one moment when my professional life might turn into a battlefield. My fingers hovered over the keypad for a second, and I watched the city blur past the glass elevator walls. Manhattan looked calm, like a postcard, but inside me, a storm had already formed. Every instinct I had sharpened over my career told me that this was my turn to strike, and I could feel the thrill of quiet, measured revenge building in my chest. I scrolled to the only saved contact in that phone, labeled simply, DK London. I pressed the call button and raised the phone to my ear. 1 ring, 2 rings. Then a low, smooth voice answered. Damien Kerr. I let a slow breath out and said the 2 words that would start everything. Phase Aurora. There was no hesitation on his end. Understood, Damien replied, his tone as calm as the Thames on a clear day. We begin. He did not ask questions because he already knew the plan. Months earlier, we had met quietly in Geneva during one of my so-called conference trips. While Victor and the Crescent Apex board believed I was chasing investor leads, I had been laying down an entirely separate set of tracks. Damien Kerr, the 45-year-old CEO of Solera Holdings, was a man who thrived in moments exactly like this. He knew how to move in the shadows of global finance, how to strike where the public could not yet see. And now, he was officially in motion. The elevator reached the lobby, and I stepped out into the warm hum of marble floors and glass doors. People bustled past me, oblivious to the quiet war I had just started. I walked out onto the street, the spring air hitting my face like a reminder that life outside of Victor Lang's glass fortress was still wide and alive. Yellow cabs honked, vendors called from the corner, and the city smelled like hot pretzels and diesel. To everyone else, I was just another woman leaving an office building in a dark blue suit. Inside, I felt like a chess player who had just moved her queen into striking position. I had been humiliated in front of 20 staff members, but humiliation fades quickly when you have a plan that can turn the tables. As I walked down the block, I mentally reviewed the sequence of events that was about to unfold. Damien's team in London would begin the first financial maneuvers. The hidden clauses I had placed in the deal paperwork were now live, waiting to be discovered by the very man who had just thrown me out of his empire. I felt a spark of satisfaction, not cruel, but righteous. Victor had underestimated me because he thought appearances were everything. He thought that walking me out of the glass conference room meant the end of my influence. What he did not know was that influence is not about being in the room. Influence is about holding the strings that move the room. Even after you are gone, I slipped the burner phone back into my pocket and lifted my face to the sunlight. A mixture of resentment and excitement swirled inside me. I thought about all the late nights I had spent building this deal, the sacrifices, the dinners I skipped, the friendships I let fade. Victor believed he could take the fruits of my labor and place his name on top like a golden trophy. That was the mistake of a man who had always had power handed to him. He did not understand that people like me do not fight for recognition. We fight to win. By the time he realized that, it would be too late for him to undo what had already begun. 2 hours after walking out of Crescent Apex with my leather portfolio under my arm and the gold fountain pen in my pocket, I found myself standing in front of a quiet brownstone in Midtown Manhattan. It did not look like a place where fortunes shifted or careers ended. To anyone passing by, it was just another old building on a tree-lined street with iron railings and flower boxes. But inside, behind the dark green door with the brass knocker, was Rothwell and Pierce LLP, a law firm that specialized in corporate fail-safes and contingency strategies that never made it into the public eye. I had come here before, but always at night, always quietly, because the kind of work we did together was not meant for daylight or boardroom chatter. I stepped into the dimly lit lobby, greeted by the familiar scent of leather-bound law books and polished wood. A receptionist nodded and led me down a narrow hallway to a private conference room. Inside, waiting for me, was Martin Pierce himself, one of the founding partners. He was in his late 50s, with silver hair and a steady calm that made him seem like the eye of a storm. "Lauren," he said with a small nod, "I take it the time has come." I smiled without humor and set my portfolio on the table. "Victor pulled the trigger this morning. It is time to start mine." Martin opened a thin folder and slid a single document across the table to me. At the top, in discreet black lettering, was the title, Contingency Framework, Lauren Hayes Provision. Hayes. The Lauren provision was my invisible armor, the clause I had embedded months ago when I realized that Victor Lang's ego was too big to trust. It was hidden deep in the merger framework with Vanguard Nexus, buried under pages of legal language. No one but a meticulous lawyer or an obsessed negotiator would notice. The clause was simple but powerful. If I was removed as the lead negotiator before the final signing, Crescent Apex Capital's voting power in the merger would be immediately suspended until an independent review could be completed. In plain terms, it meant they could not push the deal forward without me. I had not created it out of malice. I had created it because I understood exactly how dangerous corporate ambition could be, and because I had no intention of being used and discarded by a man like Victor Lang. As I read over the document, I felt a strange calm settle over me. The chaos of the morning, the humiliation of being fired in front of 20 people, the sharp edge of anger, all of it simmered down to a focused heat. My hand did not shake as I uncapped the gold pen, the same one Victor had given me as a so-called closer's token, and signed my name on the dotted line. One signature, and the first domino fell. Somewhere, in a server, in a filing cabinet, and in the minds of a few very sharp lawyers, the chain reaction had begun. I handed the document back to Martin, and he gave me a look of quiet approval. "Once this processes, they are in a corner they cannot escape without you," he said. "And by the time they realize it, the damage will already be done." When I walked out of that brownstone and onto the street, the city looked the same as it had that morning. Cars honked, people hurried past me with coffee cups, and the sun glinted off the glass towers like nothing in the world had changed. But I knew better. Behind the calm surface, a storm had started to build. In boardrooms and email chains, subtle alarms would start to go off. Lawyers would see the clause, junior analysts would panic, and eventually, the problem would land on Victor Lang's desk like a live grenade. I had dropped the first domino, and I could already see the line of tiles stretching out in front of me, each one leading to the next moment when Crescent Apex would realize they had underestimated the wrong woman. As I hailed a cab, I thought about the strange balance of power in that moment. Victor had the office, the title, and the public stage. But I had the leverage, the invisible hand that could pull the floor out from under him. I was not acting out of pettiness, though a part of me enjoyed imagining his expression when he discovered what I had done. I was acting because this was the only way to reclaim my work and my name. He had thrown me out of the room thinking that the story was over. What he did not understand was that this was only the first chapter of the battle he had just started. Back at Crescent Apex headquarters, Victor Lang was already celebrating the victory he thought he had stolen. I was not there, but I knew exactly how the scene would play out because I had watched it many times before. Victor would summon the board and the senior partners to the top floor conference room, the one with the skyline view and the endless bar stocked with crystal decanters. He would stand at the head of the table in his tailored suit, champagne glass in hand, talking about vision and leadership while acting like the last 18 months of work had been his from the beginning. It did not matter that I had built the deal from scratch or that I had negotiated every clause with a pen in one hand and a coffee in the other. In Victor's mind, the deal belonged to him now, and so did the glory. CNBC was playing on the big screen in the corner, muted but looping through headlines about Crescent Apex historic expansion and the upcoming signing with Vanguard Nexus. Victor loved moments like this. He lived for the camera flashes, the subtle envy in other executives' eyes, the feeling that the world was watching him rewrite the map of global business. He paced around the table, telling anyone who would listen that he had personally led the deal that would reshape global shipping for decades to come. I could almost hear his voice, smooth and self-satisfied, as he sipped champagne and let the board bask in his supposed brilliance. What he did not know, and what none of them bothered to check, was that the final authorization document he signed that morning was not as complete as he believed. Buried deep in the paperwork, tucked between routine approvals and standard disclosures, was a line that required a secondary counter-signature for the merger to become fully enforceable. It was not a secret. It was in the fine print, plain as day to anyone who actually read it. But Victor was not a reader. He was a talker, a smiler, a man who thought details were for other people to handle. The page also carried a small note in legal language that hinted at pending negotiator verification. But that might as well have been invisible ink to a man like Victor. He was too busy clinking glasses and soaking in his own reflection on the polished table to notice the trap he had already walked into. In my mind, I pictured him lifting his glass as the cameras flashed, talking about the future of Crescent Apex with the same empty confidence he always carried. I imagined the nods of the board members, the forced laughter, the claps on his back from men who were already calculating how much money they would make off my work. None of them realized that the victory they were celebrating was a house of cards standing in a draft. They thought I was already history. In their minds, I was gone, erased with one humiliating announcement. My career finished because Victor Lang said so. What they could not see was that history is written by the person who holds the leverage, not the person with the loudest voice in the room. While Victor was drinking champagne under the city lights, the first domino I had pushed earlier that day was already tilting into the next. Emails were being sent, legal notifications were quietly landing in inboxes. Somewhere in a secure server, the Lorne provision was triggering the process that would freeze Crescent Apex's voting power in the deal they believed they had already captured. They were celebrating on borrowed time, and the clock was ticking down faster than they could imagine. I walked through the streets of Manhattan that evening, blending in with the crowd, feeling the hum of the city around me. I passed restaurants where couples laughed over dinner, cabs racing past with their horns blaring, and the bright glow of digital billboards flashing above me. I looked like any other woman heading home after a long day of work, but I carried a secret satisfaction in my chest. I knew that somewhere high above me, Victor was toasting to what he thought was his greatest triumph. And I knew that his celebration was the first step toward his own downfall. He had forgotten the simplest rule in our world. Deals are not about the person in the spotlight. They are about the person holding the strings behind the curtain. That person was me. 2 days passed, and I could almost feel the tension rising inside Crescent Apex's glass tower without stepping a single foot inside. I knew the first ripples from the Lorne provision had reached the legal department. Someone on the team had probably noticed the clause, sent an urgent email, and watched panic spread like spilled ink across the floor of their perfect boardroom. I spent those 48 hours moving through the city like a ghost, calm on the outside, but quietly thrilled inside, knowing that the man who thought he could erase me was slowly realizing that the story was not over. And I wanted to remind him, in a way that would be impossible to ignore exactly who he was dealing with. On the morning of the second day, a courier in a dark blue jacket walked into Victor Lang's penthouse office carrying a single black envelope. His assistant, a young man with nervous energy, accepted the delivery and brought it straight to Victor's desk. There was no return address, no markings, nothing to suggest what was inside. But when Victor opened it, the entire room seemed to freeze. Inside the envelope lay the gold fountain pen he had given me as a so-called closer's token. The same pen I had used to sign the Lorne provision that started this quiet war. Next to the pen was a single yellow sticky note with 5 simple words written in my careful hand. "You forgot who wrote the rules." His assistant swore later that Victor went pale the second he saw the note. The champagne confidence from 2 days ago drained from his face, leaving only shock and a flicker of fear. He held the pen like it was evidence in a crime scene, his hand hovering above the sticky note. And for the first time in a very long time, Victor Lang was silent. I was not there to hear it, but the story traveled quickly through people who could not resist whispering. The assistant swore he heard Victor mutter my name under his breath, not in anger, but in a low voice full of realization. He finally understood that I had not disappeared. I had not accepted defeat. I was still in the game, and now he was playing on my board. I imagined him sitting in that sleek penthouse office with the Manhattan skyline spread out behind him, holding that pen and thinking back to every meeting, every late-night negotiation, every time he saw me quietly reviewing the fine print while he talked about vision and legacy. I imagined the chill crawling up his spine as he realized that the very pen he had given me as a symbol of trust and authority was now a symbol of his mistake. That pen was not just metal and ink. It was a message, a line drawn in gold that said, "I am not gone. I am watching, and I am the one writing how this ends." Meanwhile, the effects of my plan were tightening around Crescent Apex like an invisible net. Phone calls from Vanguard Nexus had started asking uncomfortable questions about missing authorizations. Analysts were whispering about discrepancies. The board, which had toasted Victor just 2 days earlier, was starting to ask for emergency updates. And all the while, that pen sat on his desk, silent but loud, reminding him that power built on arrogance is always temporary. I walked along the Hudson River that afternoon, feeling the cold spring wind against my face, and let myself enjoy the smallest hint of satisfaction. I was not out to destroy a man for sport. I was out to protect what I had built, to make sure that the months I had spent building this monumental deal were not stolen by someone who believed that titles gave him the right to erase me. The golden pen had returned to its owner in spirit, but now it lived rent-free in Victor's mind, and that was exactly where I wanted it to be. While Crescent Apex scrambled to understand why their perfect deal was suddenly stalling, Damian Kerr and I executed the next move in our plan. Solenta Holdings, his global investment company headquartered in London, had been waiting quietly in the background for this exact opportunity. Our strategy was simple but devastating. While Victor Lang and his board were tangled up in legal confusion, Solenta would make a move that would shake the market and leave Crescent Apex exposed. We announced a strategic alliance with Atlas Orion, a tech logistics powerhouse based in Singapore, known for controlling some of the fastest-growing shipping and data integration networks in the world. Atlas Orion had been circling the same industry space as Vanguard Nexus for months, and a single announcement about our partnership was enough to rattle every investor with a stake in global logistics. The announcement hit the wires late in the morning, and by early afternoon, the market responded like someone had flipped a switch. Crescent Apex stock tumbled 23% in a single trading session. Analysts who had spent weeks praising Victor's supposed brilliance were now flooding social media and finance shows with questions. How could Solenta have positioned itself so perfectly to undercut the Vanguard Nexus deal? Was Crescent Apex asleep at the wheel? The irony was that the very deal Victor tried to steal from me had left the company blind to the storm I was creating. In corporate finance, perception is currency. And that day, Crescent Apex went bankrupt in the only way that mattered first: credibility. Inside Crescent Apex's tower, panic spread faster than I could have scripted. Board members who had toasted Victor just days earlier were now calling emergency meetings. Funds were frozen as nervous investors demanded answers. Phone lines lit up with reporters requesting statements, and lawyers were frantically combing through paperwork trying to understand why the merger was suddenly paralyzed. And as if that was not enough pressure, the first calls from the Securities and Exchange Commission began rolling in. I knew exactly how it would feel for Victor to hear the words "preliminary inquiry" from a federal agency. His voice would stay calm for the first few seconds, but his hands would tighten on the edge of his desk. He would understand that this was no longer just a bad headline. This was a problem that could eat his empire alive. Meanwhile, Damian and I stayed ahead of every move. From his London office, he handled the public side, smiling for interviews and praising the potential of the Atlas Orion partnership. He spoke in confident, measured tones about the future of global shipping and the exciting synergy between Solenta and Atlas Orion. Behind the scenes, we were coordinating every piece of this chess game. My job was to anticipate Crescent Apex's legal and financial reactions, to make sure that every door they tried to run through was already locked. I had spent years watching men like Victor think they were untouchable, and I knew that the real power in our world is not in the spotlight, but in the shadow of preparation. I remember sitting in a small cafe in downtown Manhattan that afternoon, sipping a black coffee while watching the news scroll across the screen above the barista station. The anchor's voice was calm, but the words were sharp. Crescent Apex Capital stock fell 23% today, following a surprise announcement from Solenta Holdings and Singapore-based Atlas Orion. Analysts warn that the pending Vanguard Nexus merger may face unexpected delays. I smiled into my cup, unseen and unbothered. To everyone else, this looked like bad luck or market timing. To me, it was the visible effect of a plan I had built for months, triggered by one golden pen and a single signature in a quiet law office. By sunset, Crescent Apex was in full-blown crisis mode. The board had scheduled another emergency call. Investors were demanding explanations that Victor could not give. He had spent so long pretending to lead that he never thought about what it meant to actually hold the reins. Now he was holding smoke, and I was holding the future. It was the first time I felt truly in control since walking out of that glass conference room. My revenge was not loud, it was not cruel, and it was not reckless. It was precise. It was a series of moves designed to remind Victor Lang and everyone like him that erasing me was never going to be as easy as they thought. On the third day after my firing, Crescent Apex was no longer pretending everything was fine. By late morning, the board demanded an emergency meeting on the top floor of the glass tower that used to feel like my second home. I was not in that room, but I had a window into the chaos thanks to Elena Ruiz, my most loyal associate and one of the sharpest junior negotiators I had ever trained. Elena was 31, fierce and observant, and she had stayed behind to watch the implosion unfold. She sent me live updates through encrypted voice notes, each one tinged with disbelief and excitement. The first message came just as the meeting started. "Victor is sweating bullets," she whispered. "The board is furious. They are waving around your clause like it is a time bomb." I was sitting on a park bench near Bryant Park when I listened to her next update. "They found the Lauren provision," she said, her voice lower now, almost a laugh. "They can't finalize the deal without your release. Half the room is shouting. Victor keeps saying it's a misunderstanding, but the lawyers are tearing him apart. He looks like he has not slept in days." I could picture it perfectly, because I had seen Victor handle pressure before. He was a man who thrived in front of cameras and clients, but cracked the second the safety net of admiration disappeared. And now, there was no admiration left in that room, only blame and the cold awareness that their so-called leader had walked them straight into a trap. By mid-afternoon, Elena sent me another voice note that made me pause my walk just to savor the words. "They are talking about calling you," she said. "They have no choice. The board is insisting he reach out. I have never seen him this quiet." I leaned against a lamppost and watched taxis race by while the weight of the moment settled in. This was the same man who had looked me in the eye 3 days earlier, slid a termination letter across the table, and dismissed me like I was disposable. Now he was the one cornered, boxed in by his own arrogance, and forced to acknowledge that the deal he tried to steal could not move without the woman he had tried to erase. That night, the first call came. My phone buzzed, and Victor Lang's name lit up on the screen. I watched it ring, a quiet satisfaction blooming in my chest, and let it go to voicemail. 10 minutes later, he tried again. I silenced it and slid the phone face down on my kitchen counter. By the time he called the third time, it was almost midnight. I was curled up on my couch sipping tea and staring at the city lights through my apartment window. I let it ring out again, because some lessons cannot be taught with words. Some lessons have to come from silence. In my mind, I imagined his voice on the other end, rehearsing apologies or bargaining strategies, maybe even threatening in the tone he once used to intimidate junior staff. But this time, he had nothing to offer. The boardroom had become a battlefield, and the only shield he could reach for was me, the person he had shoved out the door. I thought back to the humiliation of that morning, the way 20 pairs of eyes had watched me gather my things while he smirked, and I felt no guilt in letting the calls go unanswered. I had warned myself long ago that in the world of billion-dollar deals, loyalty is a currency that rarely comes back with interest. As I powered off my phone, I felt a deep calm settle over me. I knew that silence was louder than any confrontation I could have given him. The board now knew the truth. Victor knew he had lost control. And I knew that the next move would not come from desperation on my side, but from the inevitable collapse of the wall he had built on ego and shortcuts. The boardroom breakdown had begun, and I was holding the one card they could not play without me. Friday morning arrived like the calm before a storm that had already been decided. I sat in the back seat of a black car parked across the street from Crescent Apex's headquarters, the tinted windows hiding me from the world. The streets of Manhattan moved with their usual rhythm, but to me, time felt heavy, deliberate. This was the day the last move of my plan would unfold, and I had no need to set foot in the building I once ruled. My role now was to watch from the shadows, while the consequences of Victor Lang's choices walked in through the front door. Inside the mahogany-paneled boardroom, Damien Kerr made his entrance. He was dressed in a dark charcoal suit, crisp as a knife, carrying himself with the calm of a man who always wins quietly. He was the executioner in this final act, and his steps were measured as he took his seat at the long table, surrounded by a board that no longer resembled the confident group I had once presented to. Elena Ruiz had described them perfectly in her messages the night before. Pale, tired, and broken from the week of market losses and mounting calls from regulators. At the head of the table, Victor Lang sat slumped in his leather chair, his hair uncombed and his eyes hollow. In just a week, he looked like he had aged 10 years. He expected me to walk through that door, to give him the release he needed, to save him from the cage he had built for himself. But I had no reason to step into that room. My presence was not required to end this story. I watched from the car as Damien reached into his leather briefcase and produced a familiar black envelope. Inside, it was the gold fountain pen, the one Victor had once given me with a smirk and a speech about trust, the same pen I had used to sign the Lauren provision that had locked this entire company in place. Damien placed it on the table in front of him with deliberate care. There was no speech, no warning, no need to raise his voice. He simply opened the final acquisition documents for Solera Holdings and signed them with my pen, the gold catching the overhead lights like a final flash of judgment. In that quiet moment, the fate of Crescent Apex was sealed. When Damien's signature dried, Solera Holdings officially took control of the assets that Victor had tried to use for his own glory. Vanguard Nexus would move forward under Solera's leadership, with Atlas Orion standing at its side, while Crescent Apex was left holding nothing but debt, frozen accounts, and a growing pile of lawsuits. The boardroom was silent, except for the shuffle of papers and the slow, resigned breathing of men who had just watched the walls of their empire collapse. Elena's voice note, sent just minutes later, captured the scene perfectly. "It is over," she whispered. Victor is staring at the pen like it is a weapon that shot him. No one is speaking. They are just done. Across the street, I leaned back against the leather seat of the car and closed my eyes for a moment. The wave of satisfaction was quiet, not loud or triumphant. It was the deep, steady calm of someone who had spent months planning, who had endured humiliation without reaction, and who had finally seen justice carried out in the language that our world understood best. Money, influence, and control had all shifted without me raising my voice or setting foot inside that boardroom. Victor Lang had believed that power lived in the spotlight. I had proven that real power moves in silence. As the car pulled away from the curb, I glanced one last time at the glass tower that had once been my battlefield. Crescent Apex was a hollow shell now, and I felt no guilt in leaving it behind. They had tried to erase me with a piece of paper and a public spectacle. In the end, all it took was one golden pen, a quiet plan, and the patience to let every domino fall exactly where I wanted it to. That evening, the world knew what I had known all along. The deal dominated every financial headline from New York to Singapore. On the ticker crawling across every screen on Wall Street, the words flashed like a quiet thunderclap. Solera Holdings acquires Vanguard Nexus. Crescent Apex ousted from $3.4 billion deal. To the casual observer, it was just another piece of corporate news. But to those of us who lived in the high-stakes world of acquisitions, it was a public execution. Every outlet repeated the same message in slightly different words. Solera had taken the crown jewel, and Crescent Apex had been left with nothing but its own broken reflection. The coverage hit Victor Lang like a tidal wave he never saw coming. I watched the stories play out on a muted hotel television while I sipped a late coffee in my apartment, and I imagined him scrolling through his phone, each headline cutting deeper than the last. The man who had smirked across the table at me, who thought he could erase 18 months of my work with one piece of paper, was now facing the kind of humiliation that no title or network could protect him from. Shareholders flooded Crescent Apex with angry calls. Their emails, texts, and certified letters demanded an answer to a single unavoidable question. How could the CEO let the company's biggest deal in years slip into the hands of a competitor? By the end of the week, it was no longer a rumor. Crescent Apex released a formal statement that Victor Lang had chosen to step down to pursue other opportunities. Everyone in the industry knew what that meant. He had been forced out by the same board that had once raised champagne glasses in his honor. The empire he had spent years polishing, the reputation he believed was bulletproof, had turned to firewood in less than a month. Stocks that had once been his badge of honor were now dead weight. The company was bleeding cash, tangled in lawsuits, and under investigation by the very agencies that used to invite him to speak at conferences. He had been a king in a glass castle, and I had only needed one crack to bring the walls down. I packed a single suitcase that night, my hands steady as I folded clothes and zipped the leather case shut. There was no victory dance, no need for shouting or gloating. My revenge had never been about noise. It had been about balance, about proving to myself that no one could erase me from the story I had built with my own hands. As the city lights of Manhattan flickered outside my window, I opened my laptop and booked a one-way flight to London. Damien Kerr and I had agreed from the start that if this plan succeeded, I would step into a new life across the ocean, away from the boardrooms that had once felt like home and later felt like cages. The moment the ticket confirmation hit my inbox, I leaned back in my chair and took a deep breath. The weight that had been pressing on my chest for months lifted. I thought about the first day of this fight, the sting of humiliation as I walked out of that glass conference room, while 20 pairs of eyes watched me carry my leather portfolio like a scarlet letter. I thought about the silence of my apartment that first night, when anger and clarity sat side by side, and I decided that patience and precision would win over ego every single time. Now the world had seen the truth without me ever raising my voice. As the night grew quiet, I stared out at the Hudson River, knowing that by this time tomorrow, I would be watching the lights of New York disappear from 30,000 feet in the air. My old life had ended the moment Victor Lang slid that termination letter across the table. My new life was waiting on the other side of the Atlantic. And as much as I had planned every step of this revenge, I also knew this was more than just an ending. It was the first move in a story that I was finally writing on my own terms. London greeted me with a soft drizzle and the quiet hum of a city that never felt the need to scream its power. The streets around Mayfair were polished with rain as my black car rolled toward the glass and steel headquarters of Solenta Holdings. It was a building that did not have to announce its importance. The silence and precision of its design said enough. As I stepped out, the air felt different. It was not heavy with pressure like New York or tense with corporate theater. It felt like a beginning. I walked past the revolving doors with my leather portfolio tucked under my arm, the same one I carried the day I was fired. And this time, there was no security guard looking at me like I did not belong. I belonged here. Inside the executive floor, Damien Kerr was waiting for me. He looked exactly as calm as he had the day he signed the papers that ended Crescent Apex's illusion of dominance. His tailored suit was perfect, his expression unreadable to anyone but me, and in his hand was a black folder with my name embossed in gold. "Lauren," he said in his smooth London accent, "are you ready to make this official?" I nodded, and he placed the folder on a long walnut table in his office. Inside was the final executive contract naming me Chief Global Strategist for Solenta Holdings, a role that would give me influence across continents and industries, and more importantly, freedom to write the next chapter of my career without anyone standing over my shoulder. Then Damien handed me the object that had been at the center of this entire story, the gold fountain pen. It gleamed under the soft office lights, as sharp and perfect as the first day Victor Lang gave it to me, as a token of trust he never truly had. I held it for a long moment, feeling its weight, and thought about everything that had led here. Victor had tried to erase me with arrogance, and in the process, he had handed me the very tool I used to rewrite the game. I signed the contract with a steady hand, looping my signature across the page with the kind of calm you can only feel when a storm has passed and you are standing exactly where you were meant to be. Afterward, Damien poured 2 glasses of champagne and raised his in a quiet toast. "To the table," he said. I smiled, because he knew exactly what I was thinking. Deals like ours were not about single victories or even the fall of rivals. They were about owning the table everyone else thought they were playing on. And now, I had done just that. Victor Lang had spent years building a reputation as a man who could never lose. He had spent months trying to take credit for work that was not his. In the end, he handed me the pen, the leverage, and the story. His fall was loud and public. My rise was quiet and permanent. Back at my London apartment that night, I placed the gold pen on my new desk, right beside the window overlooking the Thames. The city lights reflected against the river, and for the first time in months, I let myself breathe without any weight pressing against my chest. That pen was more than a souvenir. It was a symbol of survival, patience, and the sharp kind of justice that does not need an audience to feel complete. Every time I glance at it, I remember the boardroom in Manhattan, the humiliation, the silent elevator ride, the way anger turned into focus, and focus turned into a plan. I did not just win the deal. I did not just survive. I bought the entire table. And in my world, there is no sweeter victory than that. He blinked, then blinked again. He leaned toward the tablet, clearly trying to override. He whispered something to the systems engineer beside him. You could feel the panic start to ripple, even through the screen. The camera zoomed slightly, but it was too late. The chat exploded. What happened? Did it fail? Where's the data stream? Is this a glitch? Behind him, another line appeared under the first. Authorization timeout in 44:59, 44:58, 44:57. That countdown? That was the second part of the hold state. Once triggered, the system locked out all non-verified inputs for 45 minutes. The intention was to give both credential holders a window to re-authenticate if something had gone wrong, or in this case, if one of them had been fired. I leaned back in my chair, watching in silence. They were scrambling now. Engineers were whispering. Legal teams huddled around laptops. Someone tried to reboot the interface, but the system kicked them out. Another line popped up. Manual override disabled, deploy suspended by design. That was my language, my phrasing, my voice, embedded into the machine they thought they owned. I took a sip of coffee and let it settle. I was not gloating. I was not laughing. This was not about revenge. This was about design doing exactly what it was meant to do, a platform built with intention, care, and accountability. They thought removing me from the team would be clean, that they could just erase 19 years of knowledge with a single HR email. But what they forgot was this. You cannot delete the foundation and expect the house to stand. The silence in that room said everything. Not just confusion, not just failure. It was the sound of realization. The moment when people understand they are no longer in control, and that someone much smarter had already planned for this exact scenario. Miles kept trying to smile, but his eyes gave him away. He was panicking. He had no backup plan. He never read the documentation. And me? I was still on the outside, untouched, unseen, and holding nothing but the truth. Within 12 minutes of that failed launch, I had 3 missed calls from blocked numbers. They came in one after another, silent, desperate rings from people who had probably never looked me in the eye before. I watched each one go to voicemail without a second thought. My phone lit up again at 11:26 a.m., this time with an email from ValeCore Legal. The subject line was all caps, urgent resolution needed. That was the fastest turnaround I had ever seen from a corporate legal department. It meant only one thing. They had read the clause. Or at least someone finally had. The clause I was referring to was not some buried legal technicality. It was something I had insisted on back in 2017 when Neural Forge was still an experimental concept. It stated that if the original platform architect, me, was terminated without formal resignation or a 30-day knowledge transition, the system would enter a 72-hour security lockout. No exceptions, no overrides, no workaround. The only way out was with my voluntary biometric release. I had insisted on that clause because I knew companies like ValeCore. The moment things got big, they would try to erase the people who built it, and I was not about to let years of my life be used without my permission. The email started with a lot of legal jargon. As per Section 14.2 of the Neural Forge Platform Charter, we understand that your biometric and token credentials remain active within the core guard vault. Then it shifted tone. We are reaching out in good faith to request your assistance in facilitating an immediate resolution to the current deployment hold. And then, the part that made me pause for a second. ValeCore is prepared to offer appropriate compensation for your cooperation, as well as discuss potential non-disclosure terms to ensure mutual confidentiality. In plain language, they were offering me money to fix their mistake, and they were hoping I would agree to stay quiet about all of it. I did not reply, not because I was being petty, not because I wanted revenge. I simply had nothing more to say. They made their decision when they walked me out in front of the entire team. They made their choice when they replaced experience with marketing slogans. What they were experiencing now was not sabotage. It was consequence. The system was working exactly as intended. I was not the one who locked Neural Forge. The contract they signed did, the code I wrote did, and the clause they ignored did. More calls came in that afternoon. I stopped looking at my phone. My inbox filled with urgent follow-ups from different departments, engineering, legal, even HR. Someone named Tracy from compliance tried to sound friendly in her message. "We're hoping you can help us navigate a path forward that benefits everyone." It was too late for that. The path forward had already been written 7 years ago. In the architecture no one had bothered to learn. I could only imagine what was happening inside Verexon's headquarters. Meetings upon meetings, lawyers arguing over language, engineers digging through logs they had never seen before. Miles probably pacing the executive floor, wondering how a woman he fired less than 24 hours ago could still be in control. But that was the thing. I was not trying to be in control. I had simply designed a system where trust had to be earned, not assumed, where removal came with responsibility, not shortcuts. People think systems are just code and hardware, but they are not. Systems are values, encoded in logic. They are the result of every late night, every problem solved, every scenario imagined. I had designed Neural Forge to be secure. I had designed it to require integrity at every level. And now, the very people who treated it like a product were facing the truth. It was not a product. It was a promise. One they broke the moment they cut me out. By the end of the day, I had 5 more emails. One of them even offered me a formal apology. Another tried to sweeten the deal with equity reinstatement and retroactive compensation. I did not respond to any of them. Not because I wanted them to suffer, but because it was not mine to fix anymore. They had stripped me of that title. They had made it clear I was no longer needed. So I let the system speak for itself. Instead of wasting my energy on Verexon or trying to reclaim something they had already broken, I chose to build something better. I took the non-proprietary core of Neural Forge, the parts that were never owned by the company, the ones that I had written long before any corporate contract, and uploaded it to an open-source repository. I called it Civica Layer. The name came to me while staring out my apartment window late at night. It sounded clean, transparent, and, most importantly, human. Because that was what all of this had been about from the beginning. Not just intelligence, but responsibility. But I did not just upload code and walk away. I wrote an ethical framework directly into the license itself. It was not optional. If someone wanted to use Civica Layer, they had to agree to 3 core principles. First, the system could not be deployed without a human override in place, no fully autonomous execution. Second, transparency logs had to be permanently enabled and accessible to external review. And third, zero tolerance for government misuse. No contracts that enabled surveillance, warfare, or data suppression. If anyone violated those rules, the license would terminate automatically. I made it self-enforcing, built straight into the architecture with blockchain-verified logging. Uploading it felt like closing a door and opening another. I was not bitter. I was not trying to get revenge anymore. I just wanted to make sure that what I created would never again be twisted into something unethical. And once it was up, I did something even more important. I moved on. That same week, I accepted an offer from Rowan Labs, a firm based in Austin. I had met the founder, Daniel Reese, 2 years earlier at a tech ethics panel in Chicago. He had this quiet, grounded energy that stood in total contrast to the Miles Rennicks of the world. He believed in transparency as a design principle, not a marketing pitch. His offer was simple. Come build something people can trust. I said yes before the coffee in my hand even went cold. But I did not go alone. Saravex gave me full hiring freedom for my team, and the first thing I did was reach out to Brenda Tay. She was still freelancing after getting ousted by Verexon, and when I called, she just said, "Tell me when and where." Then I called Zane Doolin, our original AI modeler. He had been consulting for a robotics startup in Denver, but had never really found a place that let him push boundaries the way Neural Forge did. He said yes on the spot. And finally, I messaged Corey Lynn, the intern who had shown more integrity and insight than most senior managers I had ever worked with. He joined us full-time as a junior engineer. The four of us started fresh in a corner office above a bookstore in East Austin. No layers of corporate nonsense, no 15-person meetings to rename buttons, just clean architecture, clear ethics, and people who respected one another. We began rebuilding a new version of the platform. We did not copy Neural Forge. We improved on it. We stripped away the layers of bureaucracy, rebuilt the core modules for transparency-first architecture, and added new functionality that let users control every decision the AI made. It was lightweight, fast, and built for public accountability. We finished the first full version in 6 months. By then, ValeCore had already gained traction in the open-source world. Universities were using it in ethics courses, nonprofits were building applications on top of it. A healthcare startup in Finland sent us a thank you letter for helping them catch a billing error that would have harmed patients. That was the impact I had always wanted. Not quarterly earnings, not corporate sponsorships, but real traceable good. The best part? Verexon never saw it coming. They were still caught up in legal battles trying to explain why a $980 million deployment froze at launch. But that was no longer my concern. I had built what I needed to build. I had walked away with my integrity intact. And in the end, that mattered more than anything they could offer. Closure, it turns out, does not come from revenge. It comes from creation, from knowing you did not burn it all down. You just built something better. It has been a year since the launch that never happened. Verexon's reputation took a hit they never fully recovered from. After the failed deployment, clients backed out, investors panicked, and the board finally did what they should have done months earlier. They forced Miles Rennick to resign. He went out quietly. No press release, no farewell speech, just an internal memo and a vanishing act. The platform he promised the world never made it to market in its original form. Their revised launch finally happened 8 months later, patched together by third-party contractors and riddled with compromises. It cost them over $200 million in penalties and lost contracts. And yet, none of it gave me joy. It just gave me peace. As for me, I built a different life, one I chose on my own terms. I work 4 days a week now at Solenta Labs. Mondays through Thursdays are for building systems that put human safety first, not just profit. Fridays are mine. I hike outside the city, usually solo. There is something about the silence of the trail, the steady rhythm of walking uphill that clears out the noise. No code, no meetings, no politics, just sky, dirt, and breath. I never had that kind of space before. I never realized how badly I needed it. Outside of work, I spend my time mentoring young women in tech, high schoolers, college interns, first-year engineers. I tell them what no one told me, that they do not have to trade away their boundaries to be taken seriously. That power is not just in the titles, but in what you choose to build or not build. I teach them how to document their work, protect their IP, and spot red flags in job offers. Some of them remind me of myself at 24, all drive and no armor. I help them find the armor without losing the fire. ValeCore, the open-source project that started from my old code, has become something bigger than I ever imagined. It is now being used in climate monitoring tools, nonprofit education systems, and even emergency medical response apps. Every time I see it credited on a public project, every time I see a new fork with notes like built on ValeCore ethics, I smile, not because it makes me feel important, but because it means we won. Not just me. All of us who believe the technology could be built with conscience. People ask me sometimes if I regret not taking the payout, not signing the silence clause, not going back when they begged. But the truth is, I never wanted their money. I wanted my work to mean something. And when I walked away with the one thing they could not steal, the key. Not just the literal key to the system, but the knowledge, the architecture, the trust in myself. I still carry that with me. And every time someone tries to tell me what I should have done, I remember that walking away was not surrender. It was power. Miles once said, "You can either play the game or you can be left behind." What he never understood is that I was not playing his game. I was building my own, one with rules I could live with, one where the people who contributed mattered more than the people who controlled. And in the end, that game is the only one that lasted. I do not tell this story out of spite. I tell it so that someone else, somewhere, will not feel alone when they are forced to choose between what is easy and what is right. So they will know it is possible to lose everything that looks like power and still come out stronger. So they will understand that sometimes the greatest revenge is not revenge at all. It is a quiet life on your own terms. I did not have to burn it all down. I just had to walk away, with the key still in my pocket.